The night the sirens stopped, the silence felt louder than any bomb. I remember standing by the open hangar doors, the air still trembling from what had already fallen, and realizing that the danger wasn't over, it had just gone quiet. The other engineers called it mercy, a pause between raids. But I heard something else inside that stillness, a rhythm hidden beneath the quiet, the faint hum of engines long before they reached the coast. Silence should have meant safety, yet every instinct told me it was warning. I walked the perimeter of the field, boots crunching through gravel and broken glass, noting how the sky's darkness carried sound differently after each explosion. Some nights, the Luftwaffe came in low, their approach swallowed by the wind. Others, they followed a pattern of silence before the thunder that no one seemed to register but me. In the control hut, the map was a chaos of pins and string. I shifted one marker 3 miles inland, tracing where the sirens had failed to sound in time. The duty officer laughed, said the equipment was fine, that I was just hearing ghosts. He wasn't cruel, only certain that the official instruments couldn't be wrong. I didn't argue. I simply wrote down the times, the altitudes, the minutes between quiet and impact. When the others went to sleep, I stayed. The radios crackled with static, the room thick with burnt dust and cold tea. I realized then that silence itself carried data gaps in signal, pressure in air, patterns only visible if you listened for absence instead of presence. It was unsettling, but precise. The idea began there, under that impossible hush. If noise could destroy, maybe silence could defend. Outside, the night settled heavy again. A gull cried somewhere beyond the runway, the single living sound left. I folded the map, slipped my notes into a file marked routine maintenance, and locked the drawer. No one noticed. The quiet had returned, but it no longer felt empty. It was waiting like I was for proof that it could be turned into something stronger than fear. By morning, the airbase smelled of damp earth and cordite, evidence of what the night had taken. The men spoke louder than usual, as if volume could restore control. I kept quiet. The silence after impact still rang in my ears, but inside that stillness something had shifted. I no longer wanted to survive the war. I wanted to outthink it. The generals arrived in polished boots, trailed by aides with clipboards and certainty. They wanted reports, not reflections, lists of losses, not questions. Every conversation was a contest of decibels, strategy by shouting. They spoke of retaliation raids, moral victories, anything loud enough to drown their own fear. But I'd seen what noise accomplished. It announced our position, drained our fuel, and invited disaster. The Luftwaffe thrived on spectacle. Maybe our only chance was the opposite, invisibility instead of confrontation. In the design shed, I spread the charts over an oil-stained table and marked the spaces between detection points. The emptiness told me more than the data. Each gap was a pocket of silence the enemy exploited, predictable once you listened for it. I called it the corridor, a stretch of sky where our instruments went deaf. When I mentioned it to my supervisor, he sighed, the way a man sighs at a child's question he can't afford to answer. "You're clever, but not practical," he said. "We need weapons that shout back, not ideas that whisper." He wasn't cruel, just exhausted. They all were pilots without sleep, ministers with funerals in their diaries. Even my colleague, Bennett, the rival who'd later call my proposal academic fantasy, wasn't malicious. His engines worked, mine, on paper, did not. In wartime, proof trumps possibility. Yet that was the flaw. By the time something could be proven, it was already too late. I spent the next evenings cataloging frequencies, converting silence into sequences, measurements of how long, how deep, how consistent. The method was slow, deliberate. I found calm in it, as if order could be coaxed from chaos through listening. The more I recorded, the clearer the pattern became, and the less I spoke. Words invited dismissal, evidence did not. When Bennett passed my workbench one night, he tapped the folder labeled Acoustic Field Study and smiled. "You'll drive yourself mad listening for what isn't there." I smiled back. He couldn't hear what I already knew, that what wasn't there might be the only thing that could save us. The silence held its breath, waiting for me to act. And I was ready to start designing what no one else could hear. Before the sirens and the smoke, the skies over Kent were a kind of promise, clear, unbroken, so blue it almost hummed. I used to ride my bicycle out past the hedgerows to the coast, sketchbook strapped to the rack, my brother Michael pedaling ahead. He'd tilt his head back, eyes closed, naming each aircraft by sound alone. "That's a Bristol Blenheim," he'd say, before I even saw it. He loved the noise. I loved the math of flight, the symmetry, the invisible order. Back then, silence meant peace. Now it meant danger. In 1940, the same open sky had turned into a trap, a stage for the Luftwaffe's performance of precision. You could feel it in your lungs, the hum before the fall. Each raid blurred into the next, engines droning, glass vibrating in its frames, then the hollow, impossible quiet after impact. The contrast between then and now was almost cruel. What once lifted us now buried us. Michael enlisted before I finished my training. He wrote that he wanted to protect the sky. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, the telegram came 3 weeks later. His convoy was hit off Portsmouth. I remember the wording, "No remains recovered." It was both final and indefinite, a kind of bureaucratic purgatory. For months, I dreamed of the sound of him calling the aircraft names, his voice swallowed by engines. That guilt never left me, though I learned to translate it into formulas, into signal graphs that didn't ask for grief. The war machine didn't stop for mourning. I filed for a small prototype grant through the Ministry of Supply Form 1042, 3 copies, typed, signed by 2 officers. The limit was £300, barely enough for copper wire and cathode valves. I waited 6 weeks for a reply, only to receive a note stamped deferred pending review. I knew what that meant, forgotten in a stack of higher priorities. The bureaucracy was another kind of enemy, slow where the bombs were fast. While others cursed shortages, I took inventory. Every delay became a measurement. 6 weeks taught me how long an idea could survive on silence alone. The approval system valued volume, who shouted loudest in meetings, whose design looked most like a weapon. Mine didn't explode, it listened. That made it invisible in the wrong way. Yet even then, I sensed that invisibility might be our only advantage. The Germans own the sky's sound, maybe we could own its quiet. That thought became my way of keeping Michael alive, not through vengeance, but through purpose. I couldn't bring him back, but I could make the air itself answer for him. The day my requisition finally cleared, I folded the stamped form into my pocket. The ink had smudged from my thumb, but the signature was legible. Approval didn't mean acceptance, not yet, but it was a beginning, a whisper against the roar that had taken everything else. The rejection slip arrived folded in thirds, as if politeness could soften dismissal. Insufficient proof of concept, the clerk had typed, the words tilting slightly where the ribbon had worn thin. I held it to the light, watching the faint watermark shimmer behind the official stamp, rejected in scarlet ink. For a moment, I almost laughed. Proof was what they demanded, yet proof was impossible until someone believed enough to fund it. That loop, noise feeding noise, was how innovation died. So I decided to go quiet. Instead of resubmitting, I began rewriting. I filed the design under a civilian classification, communications research, non-combatant, where fewer eyes looked for weapons. It was a simple change of language. Interference detector, instead of air defense array. A semantic sleight of hand, but it opened a door. In the ministry, words were currency, silence was camouflage. I learned to trade in both. I couldn't build the system alone. My first ally was Clara, a radio operator from Portsmouth whose hearing was sharp enough to catch distortions before the instruments registered them. She signed the secrecy form without question, her fingers ink-stained from decoding shifts. Then came Malik, a mathematician from the university, furloughed when the funding for his department vanished. He'd been mapping frequencies of whale calls as a hobby, he understood patterns in chaos. The third was Tom Linton, a radar technician with the patience of stone and a habit of fixing what others called unfixable. Together, we formed a team that existed only on paper as Signal Maintenance Unit 9. Every evening after curfew, we met in the disused generator room behind the hangar. The walls smelled of oil and salt, the air always colder than it should have been. I sketched schematics on ration envelopes, lines of graphite smudged by the edge of my palm. Clara kept watch near the window. Malik scribbled calculations on cigarette boxes. Tom assembled circuits from salvaged coils. The rhythm was quiet but certain, a workshop conducted in whispers. We communicated through coded memos slipped into requisition folders. Maintenance required on set 14 meant proceed to test calibration. Interference logged at 2,100 hours meant successful signal detected. I'd write the notes in pencil, erase, then rewrite to blur the graphite's age. The less obvious the trail, the safer the progress. Some nights, fatigue pressed harder than fear. I would catch myself listening, not for planes, but for the teams breathing the human proof that the work was real. The world outside demanded spectacle, but our strength came from discretion. Each quiet success felt louder than any explosion. There's a certain kind of satisfaction in being underestimated. It frees you from the noise of expectation. Have you ever had to work in silence just to be taken seriously? Then you know how steady resolve sounds when it replaces rage. When the first prototype finally caught the echo of an engine before radar did, no one outside that room heard it. But we did, and in that soft, trembling frequency, the war began to tilt. By February, the nights had grown so cold the ink froze in its bottle. Every breath turned visible, rising like smoke above the drafting table. We worked by lamplight, not because it was romantic, but because the blackout shutters left no choice. Outside, the airfield lay in darkness, stillness pretending to be peace, but beneath it, the quiet hummed with activity. Inside our little room, silence had become its own kind of weapon. Our schedule followed the rhythm of absence. When the day shifts ended and the mechanics stumbled off for their ration tea, we began. Malik would spread his logbooks across the bench, columns of numbers aligned as neatly as a prayer. Clara tuned the receiver to frequencies no one was supposed to touch, listening for faint distortions buried in static. Tom wound copper coils with a surgeon's patience, muttering about shortages. 3 weeks for a shipment that should have taken 2 days, he'd grumble, turning the wire in his hands like spun gold. Valve replacements were worse, a 10-day delay from Glasgow because the convoy had been diverted north. Every missing part became an equation in endurance. We documented everything in the prototype logs: time, temperature, interference, and signal drift, each entry signed only with initials. I kept a separate ledger hidden beneath the floorboards, one page for data, another for deception. For every real requisition number, I forged 2 false ones, redirecting materials from defunct projects. Spare transformers for weather calibration unit became 2 more circuit housings for us. The ministry's paper maze worked in our favor. Sometimes bureaucracy hides best inside itself. One afternoon, Clara intercepted a Luftwaffe transmission fragment, half a call sign, half static. Malik ran the figures through his slide rule, brow furrowed. The pattern didn't match radar, it was reflection. We realized the planes were bouncing their own signals off the channel mist, masking their approach beneath the echo. That was the moment the array's purpose sharpened, not to shout louder, but to hear sooner. If we could map the silence between their bursts, we could predict their arrival before they crossed the coast. I drafted the formal schematic that night. The title page read Acoustic Resonance Detection System, Civilian Calibration Prototype. The description used harmless phrases: ambient atmospheric analysis, non-directional reception. Anyone glancing through would assume it was weather research. I sent the file through the internal courier with a duplicate copy marked experimental, approved. The approval stamp was mine, of course, but no one ever checked. 3 days later, a telegram arrived, thin paper, type faint but legible, from H.G. Stop. Continue quietly. Priority classified. Funds to follow. Stop. I didn't know who H.G. truly was. Bletchley had its ghosts, patrons who moved through corridors by name only. The code was simple, though: keep going. That same evening, I found an envelope in the workshop locker, inside a folded copy of the Times. £50 in treasury notes, unsigned. It was more proof than applause, and that suited me fine. Weeks blurred into patterns. Sleep became optional. We calibrated the system in the hush between raids, timing the array's ear to the rhythm of approaching bombers. Each successful detection felt like catching a breath before a scream. The motif of silence grew heavier, almost sentient, the air itself learning to listen. Then came the inspection. Bennett. He arrived without warning, clipboard in hand, the faint satisfaction of authority in his stride. Surprise audit, he said, voice smooth, eyes sharp. I saw his gaze flick to the array, a skeletal frame of wires and glass tubes, and to the logbook stacked too neatly. One wrong answer would unravel everything. I forced a smile. You're just in time to see our latest failure, I said, flicking the switch. The receiver hissed, then crackled into chaos. I had loosened one connection deliberately, enough to make the machine sputter. Bennett listened, frowned, and wrote something on his pad. Still chasing phantoms, I see. His tone wasn't cruel, only weary, another man protecting his own sense of certainty. When he left, the silence returned, thick and electric. I rewired the connector and powered the array again. A single pulse appeared on the scope, faint, but real. No one else saw it, yet it mapped an enemy plane still miles from shore. The machine had heard before anyone could see. That night, I added a new line to the logbook, 2140, 3 hours detection achieved. System operational. No exclamation, no flourish. Just fact. Around us, the world demanded noise-proof wrapped in thunder, but our victory arrived as a whisper. I closed the ledger, extinguished the lamp, and let the silence fill the room like oxygen. For the first time, it didn't feel empty. It felt alive. The first time the array spoke, it did so in a whisper. A faint pulse at 2:11 hours, so soft I almost missed it. The official radar stations reported nothing until 2:17, 6 full minutes later. 6 minutes may sound small, but in wartime, it's a lifetime. I watched the blip repeat twice, then fade, its echo absorbed into the static. When the bombs fell near the docks 15 minutes later, I already knew they were coming. The machine hadn't guessed, it had listened. I documented everything: the exact coordinates, the humidity reading, the cloud density. My logbook grew dense with those invisible moments, lines of time measured between silence and sound. Clara called them ghost tracks. I preferred pre-echoes. Whatever the name, they were proof that absence had a rhythm, and now I could chart it. 2 nights later, we captured 3 consecutive detections. Malik mapped them against known Luftwaffe flight paths and found a perfect alignment. The array had heard their approach from over the channel, before their engines breached British airspace. We celebrated with rationed tea and no words. I felt a quiet surge relief, not triumph. Our machine worked. But the ministry didn't know that, not yet. We prepared the internal report according to regulation, Form 37C, preliminary findings for technical review. 3 copies, carbon paper duplicates. I attached the logbook pages, calibration tables, and comparative radar reports. The cover sheet bore my name, though I hesitated before signing. If the project drew attention, the credit would be my shield, but also my target. Still, protocol demanded it. I sealed the envelope and sent it through the pneumatic chute marked, Technical Assessments Confidential. A week passed before the summons arrived. Briefing, Room 4B, Air Ministry, 10 sharp. The note was unsigned but official. I knew the font before I saw the sender, Bennett. My rival, my reminder of how the system preferred noise over nuance. The room smelled of chalk and damp wool. Charts lined the walls, flight arcs drawn in red pencil. Bennett stood at the head of the table, addressing 3 officers. Our improvements in signal gain have shortened detection time by approximately 6 minutes, he said smoothly. I recognized my own data projected on the screen behind him, the timestamps, the coordinates, even the weather annotations. He'd stripped my name, kept my numbers. I felt the old sting of disbelief, but it passed quickly. He wasn't stealing, he was surviving. The ministry rewarded confidence, not caution. Bennett wasn't a villain, just a man too desperate to be right in a world that punished hesitation. I didn't interrupt. Instead, I opened my notebook under the table, flipping to the original entries. Every figure had a corresponding date, initial, and ink blot. No one else could have written them. When the officers began asking about calibration variance, Bennett stumbled, giving the wrong barometric value. I almost pitied him. He knew how to perform data, he didn't know how to listen to it. After the meeting, I stayed behind, waiting until the others left. The projection sheets were still warm from the lamp. I gathered the discarded transparencies and tucked them into my folder, aligning them with my handwritten notes. Together, they formed a map of truth, the kind that didn't need to shout to be undeniable. That evening, I followed official procedure for classified evidence submission: sealed documents, serial number logged at the registry, receipt countersigned by 2 witnesses. The clerk stamped the front page twice, once for authenticity, once for secrecy, and handed me the duplicate copy. I slipped it into my pocket. The ink bled slightly from the damp in my hand, but the date was still legible: 22 March 1941. The day silence proved it could speak first. When I returned to the lab, the others were waiting. I laid the stamped copy on the workbench. "We're no longer invisible," I said quietly. Malik frowned. "To them?" "No," I answered. "To ourselves." The night hummed beyond the blackout curtains. Somewhere above, the enemy flew in patterns we could already hear coming. I closed my notebook, feeling the weight of what still had to be done. The truth existed now, written and recorded, but recognition would take longer. And I could wait. Silence, after all, was my territory. The noise began the moment our silence was noticed. Meetings multiplied, memos arrived unsigned, requisition forms went missing. Somewhere in the ministry's maze, my project had become a threat not to the enemy, but to the hierarchy that thrived on control. The official explanation came in the form of a crisp letter. Audit review irregularities in materials allocation. It was an accusation, not yet, but its purpose was clear. Make enough noise, and perhaps the quiet woman would break. I didn't. Instead, I let the chaos unfold, listening to its pattern the way I once listened for bombers. Each new demand, every lost invoice, every misfiled request revealed its own rhythm of obstruction. The louder they became, the more precise I grew. I began keeping duplicate ledgers, one for them and one for truth. Every screw and spool of wire had a corresponding entry, date, source, authorization initials. I filed everything twice, one copy into the system, another into a locked tin box under my bed. The audit officer, a well-meaning major with the soft eyes of a man out of his depth, visited in late March. He examined our logs, nodding as if he understood the equations. It's just procedure, he assured me. They say some of your requisitions were irregular. Which ones? I asked. He hesitated. Most of them, apparently. I smiled. Then the system works exactly as designed. He looked puzzled, but said nothing. People rarely challenge calm. Noise feeds on reaction, silence starves it. While they investigated, I turned my focus elsewhere toward ownership. The ministry could delay acknowledgement, but they couldn't prevent the act of filing. I spent 2 evenings drafting the patent specification by hand, careful to frame it as a non-military acoustic detection apparatus. My solicitor, Mr. Graham, an unassuming man with spectacles forever sliding down his nose, reviewed it over tepid coffee in his narrow Chancery Lane office. "This is clever," he murmured, tracing the schematic with a fountain pen. "You understand that if the ministry later claims it as Crown property, you'll have to yield?" "I understand," I said. "I just need proof it existed first." He nodded once, then handed me a typed page. Application No. 28741, filed under Section 4B of the Patent and Designs Act. The date, 7 April 1941. I signed both copies, the carbon paper smudging my fingers blue. He passed me a receipt stamped in red. Filed 12:47 amperes. M. The timestamp mattered. It marked the exact moment silence gained a name. I mailed a duplicate filing to myself, sealed and unbroken, postmarked for record. Legal habit, he'd called it. Protection disguised as paperwork. The array now had a place in the archives, even if the ministry pretended otherwise. Predictably, the retaliation escalated. Our requisition requests began returning with bold red annotations. Denied over quota. One afternoon, Bennett himself appeared at the lab, flanked by 2 clerks. "I've been asked to supervise the reallocation of your equipment," he said, voice almost apologetic. "They think it's best if we consolidate resources." Consolidate. The word tasted like theft. I handed him the official keys to the workshop, then the duplicate set I'd made weeks earlier. "Of course," I said evenly. "Everything documented." He glanced around the room, perhaps expecting anger. I offered none. He left with half the components, but not the heart of the machine. The array itself had already been moved to an unlisted storage room beneath the generator station, labeled obsolete supplies. That night, Clara and Malik helped me carry the remaining equipment through the corridors, their footsteps muffled against the concrete. "They're trying to erase you," Clara whispered. "Then they'll have to erase the record too," I replied. "And that's impossible now." We spent the next 3 weeks maintaining appearances. I attended every audit meeting, answered every question, handed over every document with quiet precision. The waiting period for the patent, 21 days, felt longer than the entire war. Each morning, I checked the post, half expecting a notice of rejection, half hoping for silence. On the 20th day, I received a telegram. The envelope was thin, the message brief. Registration accepted. Ownership transfer pending. H.G. 1247. A.M. I read it twice, then folded it carefully into my pocket. The same timestamp as the original filing, a mirrored moment of recognition. The next day, when the ministry summoned me for final review, I arrived early. They wanted to discuss disciplinary reassignment, a polite term for dismissal. I nodded at every accusation, offered no defense. When they asked if I had anything to add, I said only, "No, everything is documented." They didn't understand the weight of that word. Documentation was my armor. The louder they spoke, the more invisible I became until their own noise shielded me completely. When I left the building, the city was wrapped in blackout fog. Somewhere, church bells rang faintly through the smog. I walked home without haste, the receipt paper still warm in my hand. Control, I'd learned, wasn't about speaking louder. It was about knowing exactly when to stay quiet and what silence could make permanent. The summons arrived on government paper thick, cream-colored, the kind that carried both authority and warning. Attendance required. Air Council Review, Whitehall, 10 hours. No explanation, no salutation. Just an address and a time. By then, I already knew what it meant. Bennett had forced the issue, pushing his acoustic radar refinement into a formal review. His chance to cement credit before the War Office and to erase me entirely. What he didn't know was that the proof had already been filed, dated, and stamped. The silence had been speaking for weeks. Whitehall that morning was gray and wet, the sort of rain that flattened sound into a steady whisper. Inside, the air smelled of ink and wool, heavy with the unspoken fatigue of men who had not slept properly since France fell. They greeted Bennett with nods and handshakes, their smiles professional, polite. I was the footnote the engineer invited, for technical reference. We were led into a small briefing room, the walls lined with blackout curtains. A single projector sat on the table, its cord coiled neatly beside a stack of flight logs. At the far end, Air Marshal Graves presided, sharp eyes, slow movements, a man who measured before he spoke. "Mr. Bennett," he began, "you've requested this review to demonstrate a detection breakthrough. Proceed." Bennett stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Yes, sir. The modification to our existing radar arrays and experimental acoustic integration has allowed for earlier interception times. We believe it will reduce civilian casualties substantially." He gestured toward me. Miss Hart assisted with the initial calibration, though the theory was somewhat speculative at the time. That pause, deliberate and patronizing, was his trademark. The council murmured approval. Graves turned to me. "Miss Hart, you concur with this presentation?" I met his gaze. "Not entirely, sir." Bennett's head snapped toward me. "With respect." But I didn't continue. Instead, I reached into my case and placed 3 bound folders on the table. Each bore a thin red tag marked restricted. Inside, the original signal logs, overlaid with meteorological data and corresponding flight paths. The recordings began to play a low hum, a gradual oscillation, and then a distant echo resolving into an engine note. "This," I said softly, "was recorded at 1:13 hours, 17 minutes before standard radar registered the incursion. Our system was passive. The enemy never knew it was listening." The room stilled. Only the tape hissed, steady and unyielding. Graves leaned forward. "And this data has been verified?" "Yes, sir. By your own analysts, last Tuesday. They requested the cross-reference signatures." He exchanged a glance with his aide, who nodded slowly. "Confirmed." Bennett's face drained of color. "That can't be right, those were preliminary drafts." Graves interrupted. "They were patent schematics, Mr. Bennett. Filed 6 weeks prior under Miss Hart's name." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the rain outside seemed to hesitate. Bennett's hand gripped the table edge. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, as if realizing sound would only worsen the blow. Graves turned back to me. "Miss Hart, on behalf of the council, I commend your discretion. Your findings will be integrated into defense operations immediately. You'll receive appropriate clearance." I nodded once. "Thank you, sir." He gave a small smile, the kind that carried both respect and regret. History will remember who listened first. When the session adjourned, the officers rose, shuffling papers, murmuring in low tones. Bennett avoided my eyes. As he left, his reflection passed briefly across the polished table, flickering, unsteady, then was gone. Graves lingered. "You said it was passive detection," he remarked quietly. "Seems your entire approach was." "Silence is faster than sound," I replied. He chuckled, the sound brief and genuine. "Let's hope the world learns that lesson." When I stepped outside, the rain had stopped. The street glistened, empty for once, the noise of London held at bay by the weight of what had just shifted. Somewhere above, the clouds thinned enough to reveal a faint light. Behind closed doors, the council would file their minutes, the official histories would tidy the story, and the public would never hear my name. But it didn't matter. The record was sealed, the design secured, and the truth, my truth, was already speaking in silence. As I walked toward the embankment, the city exhaled around me. No cheers, no headlines, no applause, only the quiet satisfaction of knowing that for once, they'd listened. And for the first time, the silence didn't need defending. The memorandum arrived wrapped in brown twine, stamped confidential, Crown Technology Transfer. Inside was a single sheet, Clause 14 of the Royalty Reassignment Act, offering formal compensation for the array's patent. The line that mattered most was the smallest. Remuneration. £1, acknowledgement waived by signatory. It was both the end of a fight and the beginning of quiet ownership. They said the system was already operational across the southern coast. Reports from Dover, Portsmouth, and even as far north as Hull confirmed early detections. Bombers turned back mid-channel, casualties fell. Yet the papers told it differently. Anonymous scientists deliver new defense victory. The headlines shouted what I had whispered for years, but without a name to carry it. My rival's name appeared once, buried deep in a column about technical contributions. He'd taken a post overseas shortly after the Whitehall briefing. No scandal, no confession, just quiet departure. The ministry preferred clean exits, war left little room for grudges. When I signed the transfer, I used my neatest handwriting. The solicitor slid the document across the oak table, the air faint with ink and dust. "You understand, Miss Hart," he said, "this means the rights are wholly vested in the Crown. No future claims." "I understand," I replied. "That's the point." He hesitated, as though expecting a protest or at least a sigh. Instead, I folded the copy into my case. The silence between us was almost courteous. The government clerk notarized the document with a soft thump of the seal. Even that small sound felt final. The realism of bureaucracy, the fee receipt for 2 shillings, the waiting period for processing grounded the moment in something solid. It wasn't glory, but it was truth. A week later, a telegram arrived from Whitehall. Operational performance verified. National implementation approved. Your contribution recognized internally. No signature, just initials. I pinned it above my workbench, next to the earliest hand-drawn sketch, the one labeled, Listening Array, Mach I. The ink had faded, but the idea had not. Friends suggested I write to the newspapers, or at least accept a citation. You could be remembered, one said over tea. But I already was by those who mattered, by the lives that continued quietly because something invisible had listened. Recognition was noise, survival was signal. I walked along the coast that evening, wind sharp with salt. The radar stations hummed faintly in the distance, steady, unshowy, alive. The sound reminded me of breath present only when you stopped to notice. Maybe that was all I had ever wanted, not applause, not revenge, but continuity. Proof that silence could defend as fiercely as sound could destroy. I sometimes wonder if I chose well. Would you have taken the credit, or kept the silence? The sea didn't answer, but the horizon glowed faintly under the first sweep of the array's unseen pulse, control without noise. Victory without a voice. The sea sounds different now. The waves still break against the shingle, but beneath them runs a steady undertone, the soft electrical hum of the radar array turning above the cliffs. Once, that sound didn't exist. Once, silence meant fear. Now it means vigilance. I walk the perimeter path slowly, the air crisp with salt and metal. The young officers stationed here nod as I pass. They don't recognize me, and I prefer it that way. Their screens blink with data they take for granted, each pulse a descendant of the signal we built in secret. The war ended long ago, but the listening never did. That's the quiet triumph. The world hears what it once ignored. The contrast between then and now still startles me. In 1940, silence was a wound. Today, it's armor. I used to think victory required visibility, that justice needed applause. But noise fades faster than legacy, and legacy hums on long after the names are forgotten. Inside the station's small records office, I leave an envelope on the desk. The seal bears no title, just a line written in black ink. For the next engineer who's ignored. Inside is my first schematic, a copy of the £1 transfer, and a note that reads, "They listened to the skies because I listened first." It isn't sentiment, it's instruction. Someone will find it years from now, maybe another woman told to wait her turn, and she'll understand that silence isn't surrender, it's calibration. When I step back into the wind, the hum rises slightly, matching the rhythm of the tide. The sound I once invented to defend my country has become its heartbeat. I don't need them to remember my name. I only need them to keep listening.